What do you think of when I say the word Egypt? Perhaps you think of pyramids or hieroglyphics, two of which I've done a video on. But perhaps what you don't think of is complete political chaos. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, you have to watch to find out. Hello everyone, I am Advaith and welcome back to my channel Subodha. Last time while discussing Egypt, we discussed a lot of things. Let's recap some of that. First, we looked at the various peoples groups in Egypt: Libyans, Semites, and Nubians. After that, we looked at the pre-dynastic period, which was the entire period of time before 3150 BCE. Next, we looked at why Upper and Lower Egypt are named so. It was because the Nile begins flowing in the south, where the altitude of the river is much higher. Then it slowly makes its way northwards, where the altitude begins to reduce. Hence, the south, where it begins to flow, becomes Upper Nile and Upper Egypt, and the north becomes Lower Nile and Lower Egypt. Next, we looked at the early dynastic period. In this period, we understood the role of a king to be representative, that of a figurehead. After that, we looked at the first golden age in Egypt, the Old Kingdom era. Then finally, we looked at a historical controversy, and then I gave my views on this controversy and how it can be solved. If you want to know more about all of these things, then please be sure to check out my original video. Okay, now let's get back to today's episode. And so today we'll be discussing the three eras of political chaos in Egypt: the first intermediate period, the Middle Kingdom era, and the second intermediate period. Now let me just quickly recap the meaning of all of these periods. The periods which have intermediate in their names are those which were in a state of anarchy, which means that no king ruled the place in that particular era. The ones which have kingdom in the end of their names are the golden eras in Egyptian history. Our story begins towards the end of the 4th dynasty, during about 2284 BCE. Egypt had just become one of the most prosperous lands on earth. Architecture, trade, innovation, everything was flourishing. The people were living the dream. During this time, the king Pepi II came into power. His predecessors had perfectly set the stage for him. Agricultural reforms, food for everyone, it was basically a utopia or a dream for the common person. But suddenly, everything went wrong with no evident reason at all. Suddenly, there was fighting, chaos, lack of a king, no pyramids, no architecture. All of this completely unprecedented. But why was this? There must have been a reason for this sudden, unprecedented chaos, right? Well, there were many. For the sake of convenience, I've arranged these causes into two categories: passive causes and immediate causes. Now let's start with the first passive cause. It is deeply linked with Egyptian culture and religion. Egyptian tradition and culture had a very intriguing philosophy and a very intriguing religion. Few people began studying these philosophies. Soon, these people became the hubs of knowledge. They were the priests. Their knowledge was unmatchable, and their philosophies were extremely loved by the people. As the people loved them, the kings always wanted these priests to be on their side, to earn the people's support, that is. A clever tactic which helped them gain the support of the people and their love. And so they began giving these priests many important positions in their courts. Clever priests who understood this phenomenon, that they could drive the king's attention and earn more and more power, slowly began exploiting this privilege. All they had to do was display their knowledge. Now you see, knowledge is a great thing, it's fantastic. But this knowledge used to gain power is more malicious than power gained in any other shape or form, as we'll see throughout Egypt's history. And with this power, priests began taking control of various places in the kingdom, running them, basically becoming mini kings, making the power of the king useless. The second reason was the long life of Pepi II, the last king of the 4th dynasty. He was a good ruler by many means, but he had no heir. From what is known to Egyptologists, Pepi II outlived all of his heirs, meaning that there was now no successor to the throne, and hence no king for all of Egypt. However, the immediate and most interesting cause was a drought, an unavoidable natural calamity. Now, you see, in these times, such calamities were easy to avoid because A, the kings perfectly knew how to handle these because they were extremely frequent and so they had to adapt. And for B, the people did not know the definition of comfort in order to experience discomfort. But neither of these were true in the case of Egypt. For the first, there was no king in Egypt when we're talking about this period. And for the second, over the past few centuries, the people had experienced so much comfort that they forgot what discomfort was. And so, this calamity became worse than what it should have been. All these three problems occurring at the same time began the first intermediate period of Egypt, a period of complete chaos. All of these three conditions led to the loss of power for the king. And so he started using a political tactic. He started delegating more and more work to gnomes. Now, what are gnomes? That is something I explained here. The word gnome or gnomes is derived from the Greek word that is nomos, which means law. And hence the word gnomes roughly means law enforcing regions. So they were somewhat like modern day districts and counties. Each gnome was given a council and a vizier. So it kind of acted like an autonomous region on which the crown was supposed to have full control. Also keep in mind that the word vizier means the same as the word nomarch. And so giving away of all this power to the gnomes helped the king retain his symbolic power, because at the end of the day, all of these gnomes were reporting back to the king himself. And it would also ensure a balance of power, making sure that no one goes against the law. But this turned out to be an absolute political blunder. You see, these gnomes and their rulers, the nomarchs, began taking so much power that the power of the king completely collapsed. And so began the first intermediate period. There was no king, and even if there was, he had no power. And the people did not have food. But the strangest of all, which most people point out, is the fact that Egypt did not construct any pyramids during this time period. A strange phenomenon for Egypt by all means. But wait, there's more to this story. The conception that this period was a dark age is a one-sided story actually, an idea mostly borrowed from a scripture called the Ipuwer Papyrus. But from a common person's standpoint, this period was genuinely fantastic. Food was available at lower prices, the concentration of power to gnomes made rural development possible, and so if you were a rural peasant back then perhaps this wasn't completely a dark age. And as time and time again we have discussed on this channel, Egypt isn't just about pyramids. The fact that this period did not have any pyramids does not make it a dark age, as we've just seen, because the common person could still be enjoying a lot of comforts. And I hope that you've understood that. Okay, now moving on. What was the solution to this menace? Well, power was the solution. The power which had toppled the king was now going to become the king. A man by the name of Intef, who was a very, very powerful nomarch in the nome of Thebes, felt distraught at the condition of Egypt. And so he decided that he'd take matters into his own hands. He began a huge conquest in 2125 BCE, defeated nomarch after nomarch, and slowly reunited all of Egypt. His work was carried on by his son Mentuhotep II, and hence this reunification began the second gold age in Egyptian history, the Middle Kingdom period. His dynasty became the 11th dynasty of Egypt. This period was stark contrast to that of the first intermediate period. The notion of a culturally rich and developing Egypt started coming back. And we'll see just how. After the 11th dynasty reunited all of Egypt, the spirit of union was continued by the 12th dynasty of Egypt. And this is where the notion of a classical age of Egypt begins. The founder of the 12th dynasty was Amenemhat. His son, Senusret I, truly began this classical age. We call this a classical age because this was the pinnacle of Egyptian architecture, art, and literature. Let's talk about the architecture first. Senusret I constructed the Temple of Amun at Kanak first, after which he constructed a marvelous white marble building called the White Chapel. Apart from this, he constructed many other Egyptian temples which became hubs of Egyptian religion. The literature of this period is also worth noting. The first of such philosophical books during this period, its title is translated to be The Lay of the Harper. It debates about the various conclusions drawn at the time about a fabled afterlife. Another one of such books was The Dispute Between Man and His Ba, where the word Ba actually means soul. So the book talks about a conflict between a person and their soul regarding what comes after life. Two other such tales which later continued as folklore were the tale of the shipwrecked sailor and the tale of Sinuri. Now, these were extremely philosophical books. They taught the people to reason with their very existence. Some of these philosophical concepts are still not understood by many people, and Egypt was doing this long ago. Now, as with all great things, this period too had to come to an end. The energy of the 12th dynasty was unmatchable. And so, after their 2-century rule, when the 13th dynasty came into power, they failed to reciprocate the 12th dynasty's energy. And so began the decline of the Middle Kingdom. This fact, combined with the forces of a new invading force called the Hyksos, began the second intermediate period in Egypt. But wait, who were these Hyksos? Well, the crude form of this word Hysko is actually Heko Khasut, which means invaders of foreign lands. Hyksos were actually a race from the Fertile Crescent region, more specifically from Jericho. Now, if you read any text written by an Egyptian person during this period, it will tell you that the Hyksos were cruel invaders. But from what has been proven recently, the Hyksos were a highly assimilated community. They mixed with the people of Egypt. And then, after mixing with these people, they slowly began their rise to power through the use of political tactics. And so, using the term invaders for Hyksos does not completely make sense. During this period, there was once again the division between Upper and Lower Egypt. During this period, Upper Egypt was ruled by a race called the Nubians, while Lower Egypt was ruled, of course, by the Hyksos. Now, the nature of the second intermediate period is very similar to that of the first intermediate period. There was no king who had power. Okay, next there was no aristocracy. Then Egypt was divided into Lower and Upper Egypt. And so, it did resemble the first intermediate period. But again, as we saw back then, there is another side to this story. Rural life still flourished in the second intermediate period because the Hyksos kind of saw themselves as kings, as pharaohs, as people of Egyptian descent. And hence, they considered themselves the forefathers of this land and did not want to punish their own subjects. Instead, they wanted their development. And so, the nature of this period is very similar to that of the first intermediate period. And so, with that in mind, we have finished today's video. We have touched upon the three subjects for today's video, that is the first intermediate period, the Middle Kingdom, and the second intermediate period. And so now, let's look at today's takeaways. First, we looked at the causes to the rise of the first intermediate period, after which we looked at an alternate view on the first intermediate period. Then we looked at the classical age of Egyptian history, that is, the Middle Kingdom, after which we looked at its subsequent decline, and finally the rise of the second intermediate period and the rise of the Hyksos. So that's it for today, and I'll see you in the next episode where we'll be discussing the last four periods or three in ancient Egyptian history. So if you enjoyed the video, then please make sure to like and subscribe and click the bell icon to remain notified. If you know someone who is interested in videos like these, then please do share these videos with them. And I'll see you in the next one.